And now I am honored to welcome to the stage the governor of Colorado, John Hickenlooper, along with our co-host, Charles Duhigg. Governor? Charles? Thank you. Governor, thank you again.
You bet.
All right, be well.
Thank you all so much for joining us this morning. Thank you, Governor, for coming out to balmy New York City, I'm sure. So I think it's a safe bet that if we were having this conversation 40 years ago, and we were to judge who in this audience is most likely to end up being a potential vice presidential nominee, you might come down dead last on that list. And in the late 20s, for anyone who's not completely familiar with your biography, in your late 20s, you moved to Colorado to join the energy industry. You get laid off a couple years later, and you decide to use your severance to start a microbrewery. The microbrewery ends up in Denver, ends up being immensely popular. I think, how many locations did you guys end up having?
We ended up with 14 around the Midwest.
14, okay. Then you decide to run for governor. I believe in, tell me if I'm getting this wrong, the first political issue that you really
First I ran for mayor.
Oh, I'm sorry, for mayor.
You just don't jump into politics as governor.
And prior to running for mayor, the big issue that you made your name on initially was whether the name of the baseball stadium should be Mile High or whether it should be changed to something else. And
Sold.
You were able to broker a compromise, I think, on that. Mm-hmm. You become mayor of Denver, immensely popular. I think at one point you had a 91% approval rating. This is before pot is legal in Denver, so people are actually making good choices. You go on to become governor of the state, and I have kind of famously managed to find compromise on a number of issues that have been beguiling for a number of other politicians. So let me take a step back, because many people have mentioned you as a leader who demonstrates this ability to find compromises. Tell me how you have thought about that throughout your political career, particularly given what's going on right now with a deeply divisive race.
So I would argue that there's value in having a bunch of private sector experience before you get into politics. And I never ran for student council or a class president. I just, ran for mayor of Denver because a bunch of my customers, they were always criticizing everyone. I said, you guys, this is America. They are us. You should run. They said, no, you run, big mouth. And then after the Mile High Stadium compromise, I went around and visited other mayors. And I took with me the experience of running big, high-volume brew pubs, right? Basically restaurants with breweries inside of them. When I tried to get my mother to invest, I'd say, it's like a bakery. She still didn't invest. In a restaurant, high-volume restaurant, you learn that everyone's on your team. It doesn't matter who they are. When you're in the weeds, everybody, or as we say in Colorado, when you're in rough water, everybody paddles. So you also learn that when a customer's unhappy, you learn how to diffuse that. You repeat back to them their same statements. Oh, the soup was hot. She didn't look where she was going. She threw it right in your lap. All these things that ultimately the best way to persuade someone or to realign their thinking is to listen harder and get them to repeat again and again different facets of what their concerns are. And in so doing, you allow them to look at, instead of a narrow pie shape of self-interest, to see a broader self-interest, more possible outcomes to your conflict that for them are still wins. And I think that's a lot of what we've lost in the public debate, is that the real listening and really kind of just continuing to ask questions. I think when you're trying to persuade someone, telling them what you think and what you know that they should think generally turns them off, pushes them away. Whereas just continually listening and trying to draw out different aspects of their concern lets them feel a little more comfortable, a stronger position, and more likely to see at least a little slightly different perspective.
So let me ask about how you made one of those particular cases. Because when you were the mayor of Denver, and Denver, it should be said, is the fastest growing or one of the fastest growing cities right now in the United States, right? So as far as cities go, it's a model of what can go right. One of the early things that you did is convince the population to give back $3 billion in tax refunds that they were eligible to get in order to invest in the city. And I think that's probably one of the reasons why it's so fast growing right now. and I know a lot of people in this audience, they face similar things. There are arguments they would love to make to their constituents, to their populations, to do something that hurts in the short term and pay off in the long term. How do you make that argument? Because you made it successfully.
Well, again, part of it's listening to what their real concerns are. Part of that huge infrastructure investment, separate from the tax refund, was the light rail initiative, what we called fast tracks. And you're probably planning on talking about that later, but I'll jump to the punchlines. We proposed 119 miles, eventually it became 122 miles of new light rail tracks, the largest transit initiative, I think, in the history of the country. And this came to the ballot in 2004. And we had, at that time, 34 municipalities throughout the metro area, 2/3, almost 3/4 of them suburban and Republican. And we were proposing a 0.4% sales tax increase, a very large, probably the largest sales tax increase ever. And we spent enough time really listening to what those concerns were of the Republicans so that we got all 34 mayors in the metro area, Republicans and Democrats, to unanimously support a 0.4% sales tax increase for the metro area, which is 2.5 million people. And a big part of that was listening, hearing that they say, well, we don't even have in my little suburb, light rail doesn't even come near us. And so we got traffic engineers to do an analysis of their typical residents, how much time they spent commuting, right, to get to work every day, and showed that if we did this transit initiative, their citizens would, for 28 cents a day, or 24 cents a day in increased average taxes, sales tax, they'd save 28 minutes in commuting time. So really what they were doing is paying a little more sales tax to get other people out of their way. Other people would get into light rail, but everyone commutes everywhere and they use the same arterials. And that that persuaded probably over half the suburban mayors, that persuaded them, this does make sense. And they went back and told their citizens and everyone came along.
Do you see, I'm from New Mexico, so we get to observe Colorado a lot and then make all the mistakes that you guys managed to avoid. Do you see...
That's not true.
Do you see, when you look at cities around the country now, because I know that you've been traveling a bunch, do you see that leaders making a mistake, that they're not finding this consensus? I know that, politics is divisive right now in Colorado, everywhere else, particularly in the primaries. Are people making a mistake in that they're not finding the consensus, or are they playing to their own extremes to shore up a primary challenge, and that's why we don't see as much getting done? Or do you think cities are actually doing exactly what you did and solving this problem pretty well?
I think the more local, the further down the food chain you get in government, the more listening you see and the more compromise. And that in many cases, and this is in local politics as well, but in many cases, you see the partisanship and the intensity of the campaigns carry over after the elections so that people aren't willing to make any compromise. And the kind of traditional government leader approach, which is lecturing, here's what's good for you, you don't see that as much on a local level. And part of it is, the money in politics now, that now corporations are people, so money pours in at a level we haven't seen, and most of that money goes into, attack ads. And you look at the consequence of what attack ads do after the election. In other words, people on both sides, it's not just the candidates, but on both sides are so bitter and really angry. This is not the whole part, but a part of the equation. You never see it in the private sector, right? Coca-Cola and Pepsi literally hate each other. I shouldn't, if Muhtar Kent was here, I'd have to reframe that in some way. But they do. You can't find two companies that have a greater dislike for each other, but you never see them do attack ads against each other. They'd work. If Coke did, or Pepsi did an attack ad against Coke, Coke's sales would go down. Coke would attack Pepsi. Sales would go down. They'd have no choice but to keep attacking each other. You depress sales in the entire product category of soft drinks. What we're doing as a country is we're depressing sales in the product category of democracy. And people are turned off, especially young people. They just tune out. They don't go into the details of policy. They're just like, why bother? It's just such a mess.
So and I want to get to some of the hard decisions you made, because not everything was built around consensus, but what's the solution to that problem? Because and I know that you've been through, your last race was a tough race for governor. if someone's attacking you, can you really sit on your hands and not attack back? Is it always, or is it going to become a zero-sum game where as long as one person's willing to attack, we got to go to negative politics?
Well, when someone's attacking you, especially if they're distorting facts, and as so often happens with attack ads, you're diminishing the other person by taking things out of context or exaggerating the relevance of something, you've got to respond. And I think Barack Obama demonstrated that in 2008 and again in 2012. You've got to answer every attack. But you don't have to answer with an attack ad back. Now, almost everyone does. And in fairness, I still, 2 campaigns as mayor, 2 campaigns as governor, I've never run an attack ad, and I've worked very hard to make that part of the brand and the identity, and we talk about it during the campaign. It doesn't mean that when I've been unfairly attacked, outside money has come in and attacked my opponents and gone after them pretty hard. It's debatable how effective that is or not, but I'd be a hypocrite if I said, there's been no attack ads in my campaigns. There have been people punching on my behalf, at least certainly not at the same level. The punches that came in were not matched by the outgoing punches, but attack ads are so effective, you almost have to have some sort of attack ad back. But I would argue to the media, especially the print media, but all media, that the prevalence of attack ads and how much they're paying for these ads on television and various media, they are driving people away from reading the news. And ultimately, there is some balance.
That's interesting.
Yeah, I think in a funny way, the media is taking the money short term to their long-term detriment.
I think that'd probably be a fair issue to raise. So let me ask about some of the areas where consensus has been harder to achieve.
Okay.
Your first couple of years as governor, one of your advisors summed it up as being about gays, guns, and grass, because these were the issues that kind of dominated the conversation. And on a number of those, you ended up staking out a position that was very controversial within the state, sometimes more controversial than I think you actually even imagined. Let's talk about guns for a moment. After the Aurora killings, you got behind one of the biggest gun control initiatives in the nation, right?
Well, but it's important to state the first thing I did was go after mental health, because you couldn't, and going up the day after the Aurora shooting and looking at the video in the police trailer and seeing the crime scene, which hadn't been touched, one of the most sobering experiences of my life. I think anyone who saw that would be changed forever. But you clearly could see that that was a person who had serious mental health issues, right? Who knows the depth of where he was to do that? But we added $30 million to our mental health, really in terms of a state the size of Colorado, more than doubled the actual flexible resources we had. 24/7 crisis centers, mobile crisis, or 24/7 hotlines, 24/7 crisis centers, mobile crisis centers, and a big program to get people to talk about their mental health. These days you'll talk about the cold to anyone, but if you've got a mental health issue, you generally don't talk about it to anyone. We pushed that first. But in the process of doing that, first we started talking about background checks, and literally every Republican I knew, all the donors and business leaders I knew, said, no, we're completely supportive of universal background checks. And we went through this whole process. We got to the legislators, and whereas I literally couldn't find a single Republican out in the business world that was against it, I couldn't get a single Republican to support it. And we're just about evenly balanced. Colorado's 1/3 Democrat, 1/3 Republican, 1/3 unaffiliated, and our General Assembly is about half and half. The Republicans have the Senate right now, Democrats have the House. Back in 2012, it was reversed. Or 2013, it was reversed. That standoff, we started pushing universal background checks through anyway. It became this big, people driving trucks and cars around, honking their horns all day long, flying banners over the establishment, don't take our guns. And we kept saying, we're not taking anyone's guns, but it becomes this inflammatory situation. And I came home one night, and I was telling this story last night. My son, Teddy, at that time was 11. So he was in 5th grade, and I'd had a bad day, and I made the mistake of complaining. Don't ever complain to an 11-year-old. And he goes, Dad, what do you do all day at work that's so hard? You make decisions? And I said, well, Teddy, it's not that easy. He goes, Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next. I said, no, Teddy. He goes, no, Dad, get the facts, make a decision, check, next.
The Republican candidate says the same thing.
So Teddy looks at me and goes, I have to go to school every day and learn something completely new I didn't know existed the day before. If I don't get it completely right, my next day is misery because everything's based on the day. But after 3 minutes, I said, Teddy, you're right. 5th grade is harder than being governor. But up until that point, we had taken the national facts on background checks. And I went into the office next morning and called our public safety folks and said, in 2012, when we got to half the gun purchases, did we really stop anyone? The Republican legislators were saying, hey, crooks aren't stupid. They're not going to get a background check. Why are we spending $10 and waiting 15 minutes when we want to purchase a weapon? And in 2012, getting to half the gun purchases, there were 38 people convicted of homicide who tried to buy a gun, and we stopped them. 133 people convicted of sexual assault, 620 burglars, 1,300 people convicted of felony assault, where someone goes to the hospital. There were 420 people that had a judicial restraining order, not to see their ex-spouse or their ex-boss. They tried to buy a gun and we stopped them. And just in case you don't think crooks are really that stupid, there were 236 people that when they came to pick up their new gun, we arrested them for an outstanding warrant for a violent crime. I mean, it's like, how could you possibly argue against the efficacy of something where we had 3,000, Colorado's 5.5 million people, 3,000 violent criminals who we stopped by getting to half the gun purchases? Why wouldn't you want to do that on a universal basis?
Well, so let me ask this question, because I think the reason I wanted to ask about guns is because, and tell me if I'm wrong on this, is that it seems like part of the divide that we're seeing is not necessarily left and right, but cities versus rural on guns, right?
Absolutely.
Cities, gun control has been a city issue for the last 20 or 30 years. Bloomberg was a big proponent of it. You've been a proponent as a former mayor of a big city. Do you find that in Colorado, in making this argument, does it break down to cities versus rural, or is it a deeper divide than that? Why has it been such a controversy for you to make what seems like a pretty sensible policy decision?
Well, obviously part of it's the politics, and the NRA has a commercial interest in making sure that they fan the flames. Sales of guns in Colorado, when we went through this debate, almost quadrupled. It is a commercial advantage to have guns. If you're selling guns or you're manufacturing guns, the gun debate is every time it roars into flame, gun sales go up. So you got to recognize that it is rural driven, but most rural people didn't have a problem with background checks any more than urban people.
Interesting.
So that's really driven by the NRA looking at it as an advantage to create anxiety about is our Second Amendment right endangered?
That's interesting. So let me ask about another issue that you guys are at the forefront of that more cities are going to be dealing with, which is pot legalization, marijuana legalization. You were opposed initially. In fact, again, tell me if I'm getting this wrong. There were ballot initiatives to increase funding for education significantly, and that you were a firm supporter of. And there was a ballot initiative to legalize marijuana as for recreational use, which you were opposed to. You ended up striking out completely on those. The tax increase for education went down. Pot legalization is now, when I was recently in Denver and decided that I needed to do some on-the-ground reporting, so I walked into a dispensary and bought a couple of samples.
Needed to relax.
I felt like my ethical obligation as a journalist was to sample the wares. They work. It was very effective. Probably every city is going to be either dealing with this issue or dealing with it on the ballot. And you've actually had to change a little bit in your thoughts on it. Tell me how you feel now about marijuana legalization.
Well, first, you don't want to be in conflict with federal law. That's why almost every elected official I knew opposed it. It's just, even Amsterdam didn't legalize it, right? They just decriminalized it. And to create a legal framework from scratch in a state that's in conflict with the federal government, you just know it's going to be a steep hill. Yeah. But once past 55-45, once the voters speak at that level, I think at least I look at it, I had an obligation to see if we could make this work. And I talked a lot about how it was going to be, a major social experiment, right? Probably the major social experiment in the first couple decades of the 20th century. And I had a young man named Andrew Friedman, who was a Harvard Law graduate. He'd worked on my campaign. He'd been the chief of staff for lieutenant governor, very talented young man. I don't think he was quite 30. And I said, all right, I want you to own this. I want you to make sure we bring all the stakeholders together and try to create a regulatory framework that's not full of red tape, but that is balanced and fair and gives this, let's see if it's possible that you can take a system that clearly didn't work. I mean, look at how many kids we sent to jail for nonviolent offenses. I mean, literally in this country, millions. Let's see if we can do something that's better. And he and his team, and again, I tell all the governors, we were at the National Governors Association last weekend, I told a couple governors, I'd still wait a couple years. We're not clear on the unintended consequences. We were very worried about there'd be a spike in teenage usage, and this high THC marijuana, every brain scientist I've talked to is convinced if your brain is still rapidly growing in your teenage years, even just once a week using high THC marijuana, you'll lose some part of your long-term memory permanently. So kids don't understand this. We were worried about that spike. We were worried about people driving while high. We were worried about edibles and infants and kids getting to it. And in most cases, I mean, we've had some problems with edibles, but it hasn't been huge numbers. We haven't seen a spike in young people usage. We're measuring it much more frequently, but I don't think we've seen a big spike in people driving while high. To a large extent, the people that were smoking it before it was legal still are. And the people that weren't smoking it before it was legal still aren't.
That's interesting.
And the one thing we're beginning to see, and we just have anecdotal evidence so far, but places where you normally had drug dealers congregating, right, day labor centers, things like that, we're seeing less drug dealers, which to a certain extent makes sense if we tax it appropriately. So you take the risk of dealing at an illegal level marijuana, so it's not worth drug dealers doing marijuana anymore. That means let's say a dealer is half their throughput is marijuana, and the rest is they're selling cocaine or crack or heroin, whatever. If suddenly you take away half of the total drug that's going through the system, it makes sense that you're going to have a lot less salespeople in that system. And I think we're beginning to see less drug dealers. And I asked one 18-year-old I was asking him, do you think more kids are using marijuana? And he looked at me and said, listen, if you guys get rid of the black market, drug dealers don't care who they sell to. And I could, this kid was 18, 19, he says, when I was 13 years old, I could get marijuana anytime I wanted. It wasn't expensive. The black market was everywhere. You use the money that you're getting. We're getting about $125 million a year in tax revenue. It's a pittance when you look at we're a $27 billion a year budget. So it's not going to fix any social problems in the state, but it does allow us to market to young people about the dangers of using marijuana. It allows us to regulate the system appropriately and make sure everyone's playing by the framework we've created. We'll see. Again, I think the jury's still out, but it might turn out that this can work.
It's interesting. And I want to open it up to questions. And I'll mention, you've probably seen it up on the screen, if you want to email a question, feel free to email it to q@nytimes.com. It'll come to my iPad, or we'll go in a second to your questions from the audience. Before we do, let me just ask one other question, which is, most of the folks listening to this conversation are leaders in municipal governments. They're working in mayoral departments, they're mayors themselves, they're state legislators. If you could go back and give yourself a piece of advice when you were governor or mayor of Denver, what would it be? What do you wish that you had known then that you know now?
Well, I certainly would have, there are a couple things I would have worked on more aggressively. I mean, the whole notion of listening and how do you persuade people and create consensus, we didn't really understand. We did it instinctively. But I certainly would try to work harder to get people from all walks of life involved in the decisions and having some sense of ownership. Again, whether it's attack ads or whether it's just the money in campaigns, but so many people are turning away from democracy, and democracy is based on getting people from business and from academia, from nonprofits, getting everybody at the table and committing themselves to making our system work. I mean, American democracy is a pretty fragile institution. It becomes even more fragile if people aren't involved. So yeah. I think I would have pushed harder on that as well.
So let's go to some questions from the audience. Feel free. Yeah, ma'am, right here. And I'll send the mic around. Anyone else for a second question? We'll wait till you ask.
Hi, I'm a New Yorker, and I wonder how you're doing with affordable housing in Denver and Colorado in general.
And that's one of the questions of the day for any elected official at any level, I think. And those places where we're succeeding in terms of driving the economy, getting rid of red tape and bureaucracy, creating, a big part of our challenge now, I think, is creating a more rapid transfer or transition from when a whole industry or a career is disappearing. How do you get people trained into the new economy? That, if you're successful at that and your economy's doing great, you begin to price people out of where they traditionally have lived. We see it in New York. We're seeing it in Denver. We're trying to look at actually mapping and graphing how much time, depending on, as a function of your income, how much longer you spend commuting. And it looks like it's not just a straight line, quote, it might be a square, and I think that's something, in terms of social justice, it's if people who are making the least amount of money are spending twice as much time getting to and from work, I think that will push people to do more. But the big challenge in many ways is our affordable housing has always been the housing that's 30 years old or 50 years old or 100 years old, and becomes less fashionable, and so the more successful people move into different neighborhoods. When you're growing rapidly, you don't have enough 30-year-old housing and 100-year-old housing because you've had so many people move into your community. And that's the real challenge, and dealing with it is immensely expensive. I mean, incredibly expensive. And I think we need to do a better job of a sliding scale, because right now we're giving support only to the lowest income people who are looking for housing, or then that kind of next step up the rung with various voucher programs. Middle class people are really also getting pushed way out. Even as their incomes go down, they're getting pushed further away from their jobs as well.
I think we have one in the back there, and then we have one over here if the second mic runner wants to come over.
Hello, thank you very much. We've actually come here from Australia to attend today, so we're very pleased to be here. I'm interested to learn about, and it builds on the last question, whether you have a long-term shared vision for your city and how that's being implemented.
So I think the best example, and I wish I could say it was Colorado, but the best state that does this is Utah. Governor Herbert, he was the chair of the Western Governors Association, then I became the chair after him. I was the chair of the National Governors Association a few years later. He became chair afterwards. The great thing about governors is we steal each other's ideas rapaciously. And we rejoice in that, and we view it as an honor when other states emulate. And they had a program, almost 20 years ago that they began called Envision Utah. And they got people all up and down the Wasatch Front, and all different they use church groups, they use chambers of commerce, but got everyone involved in the long-term vision of what kind of infrastructure do we need in Utah. And if you look at the investment that they've made in light rail, in making sure their interstates have the capacity to handle their growth, they are as good as it gets. And again, they are one of the places where they've done a terrific job of giving everyone a voice, of making sure everyone's heard. We did a water plan, the first time Colorado's ever had a statewide water plan, and we used a lot of their models, but we ended up with 32,000 people participating in that process over the course of almost a decade. Really in the last 5 years, I guess, or 4 years. They do that as a regular basis. So again, reaching out to every network you can get and making sure they really get a voice.
Sir, right here. If you can bring the mic over. Yeah.
Governor, I was so inspired by your stories about how you implemented the mass transit. And I wonder, are there any vehicles for those success stories to get them out to the general public?
Sure. I mean, it's the media, but these days, the media is so fractured that it's hard to get a consistency or get real penetration on that. The New York Times has done a nice story on that some years ago. Politico did a big story this past spring on what something like that is really, we're just implementing it now. So we're going to have we just opened this spring, the line from downtown out to the airport. And we managed to we borrowed $300 million to build our Union Station to something that wasn't just a transportation hub. It really is a thing of beauty and an inspiration for people to use transit and kind of make it easy and more exciting, just a better experience. That kind of stuff gets out in these stories, but it's hard to get it out in a universe of social media. It's hard to get it out with any kind of detail that people, especially young people, will pay attention to.
We're almost out of time, and before I let you go, because you're a Democrat, you're nationally prominent, and the Republican convention is going on right now. What is the best thing you think you're going to hear out of the Republican convention this week?
You have to give me more time to think about that. I worry. And I've been very blunt, and I try to stay out of some of the more bitter disputes, but I look at Mr. Trump's, I think, flagrant disregard for the truth and the facts, and so much of what we're trying to talk about in terms of local government is based on convincing people they can trust, that we can work together, and that we are them, and that we can build infrastructure and do it as efficiently as possible. Not that we don't make mistakes, but I worry about that so much that I haven't looked at the benefit. I guess I don't know. I'll come to that by the time the end of the day is. I'll send you an email.
That sounds good.
You can report back.
Well, thank you so much, Governor. Thank you for joining us, and thanks for the conversation.